In the vast ledger of human history, certain deaths are remembered not merely for the passing of a ruler, but for the symbolic destruction of everything that ruler represented. The death of Roman Emperor Publius Licinius Valerianus in the year 260 CE was one such moment. It was not the quiet end of a sovereign on his bed, nor the sudden death of a general struck down in battle. It was a deliberate spectacle engineered to strip away the dignity of Rome itself, to reduce the mightiest empire of its age into something fragile, humiliated, and broken. When Valerian was captured and executed by the Persian king Shapur-Fuz, it was not simply the fall of a man. It was the ritual desecration of Roman authority, an event that echoed across nations and centuries. To the Romans who believed their emperors semi-divine, almost untouchable, the sight of one of their own emperors degraded in such a way was a wound deeper than any battlefield defeat. And to the Persians, it was more than victory. It was a proclamation that they had supplanted Rome in power, glory, and divine favor. To understand why this single death left such a scar, we must place it within the turbulent canvas of the 3rd century CE. Rome was already staggering under the weight of what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire faced a whirlwind of disasters, constant invasions along every frontier, famine and plague that hollowed out its cities, economic collapse as currency devalued, and above all, political chaos. Emperors rose and fell like sandcastles in the tide, more than 20 of them, within 50 years, most meeting violent, bloody ends. It was a time when imperial purple was not a robe of glory but a shroud of death. The legions, once Rome's greatest strength, had become both sword and executioner of emperors. The empire fractured into pieces, generals declaring themselves emperors in distant provinces, regional breakaway states rising and falling with alarming speed. Against this backdrop of chaos, the eastern frontier loomed as both Rome's richest prize and its gravest danger. For centuries, Rome had sparred with eastern powers, the Seleucids, the Parthians, and now the rising Sassanid Persians. But the Persians were different. The new dynasty, born in 224 CE, was vigorous, aggressive, and ambitious, claiming to restore the ancient glory of Cyrus and Darius. They were not content to repel Rome. They sought to eclipse her. In Shapur-Fuz, they had a king who understood that war was not only won with armies, but with symbols. The death of Valerian would prove the ultimate symbol. To the Romans, death in battle could be noble, even glorious. An emperor cut down by sword or spear could still be remembered as a martyr for Rome. But humiliation, that was something entirely different. In the ancient world, honor was currency, humiliation, bankruptcy. Rome's enemies knew this, and Shapur intended to bankrupt her spirit. The story of Valerian's death is therefore not just the tale of one emperor's grim fate. It is the story of how empires communicate through cruelty, how the treatment of a captive ruler could tilt the scales of history. And for Rome, already trembling under the storms of the 3rd century, this act would drive the empire further into its long crisis. What follows is not just history, but a tragedy. An emperor who sought to save his empire, only to become the symbol of its deepest humiliation. Amid the storm of assassinations, invasions, and famines that consumed the Roman world, Valerian's rise seemed at first like a rare moment of stability. He was not some obscure officer proclaimed by desperate legions, nor a usurper clawing his way to the throne with blood and bribery. Publius Licinius Valerianus was a seasoned statesman and elder among emperors. Born around 200 CE into a respected senatorial family, Valerian had built a reputation for competence rather than charisma. He had governed provinces, led armies, and most importantly survived decades of imperial turbulence with his integrity intact. At a time when emperors were chosen and discarded like dice rolls in a tavern, this made him a figure of trust. His colleagues in the Senate once described him as a man who never sought the purple, but upon whom the purple could rest. When the empire cried out for a steady hand, Valerian was chosen in 253 CE. The Romans placed their hopes in him. He was not young already, past 50 when he took power, but perhaps this was an advantage. Rome had gambled too many times on ambitious men in their prime who had burned bright and died violently. An older emperor tested by time might prove durable, or so it was thought. Valerian did not rule alone. From the outset, he shared power with his son Gallienus. This was not simply nepotism, it was necessity. The empire had become too vast, its enemies too many for one man to manage. Gallienus would govern the western provinces, facing the ceaseless waves of Germanic tribes pressing the Rhine and Danube. Valerian would take charge in the east, where the most dangerous threat awaited the Persian king Shapur I. This division of power was both pragmatic and symbolic. Pragmatic because Rome's survival demanded two emperors working in tandem. Symbolic because it reassured Romans that continuity was possible. If Valerian fell, Gallienus would still stand and the dynasty would endure. In a century where emperors perished in months, that promise of endurance mattered. For a time, the partnership worked. Gallienus would later prove one of the most capable emperors of the century, reforming the army and fending off crises that might have destroyed the empire altogether. But in those early years, his father was still the senior Augustus, the weight of Rome's dignity resting on his shoulders. Valerian's accession came with immense expectations. He was proclaimed not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. The empire was bleeding provinces, slipping from Roman control plague, hollowing out cities, soldiers mutinous for lack of pay. To ordinary Romans, the emperor was not merely a man, he was the guarantor of order, the living embodiment of Rome's eternity. To see him command armies and march eastward was to believe for a moment that the empire still had strength left to give. But with expectation comes danger. For if Valerian was to be remembered not as just another emperor who died in chaos, he would need victory, and not in the safer western provinces, but against the empire's most formidable foe. The fate of Rome's honor now rested in his eastern campaign. Across the Euphrates, Rome faced an enemy unlike the wandering tribes or fractured kingdoms of the frontiers. Here stood the Sassanid Persian Empire, young yet ancient in spirit, claiming to revive the legacy of Cyrus the Great and Darius. Founded in 224 CE by Artaxerxes I, who toppled the Parthians. The Sassanids were disciplined, centralized, and burning with ambition. They saw themselves not as barbarians testing Rome's walls, but as the rightful equals, perhaps even the destined successors of Rome's world dominion. Into this dynasty was born Shapur I, son of Artaxerxes, who ascended around 240 CE. If Valerian was a man chosen reluctantly by circumstance, Shapur was moulded for kingship from birth. His very title announced his ambition, Shahanshah, King of Kings. Unlike the Parthians before him, who had often fought Rome in scattered raids, Shapur envisioned an empire, expansive, orderly, and unshakably proud. And he understood something Rome had not yet faced in centuries, that victory was not merely measured in battles, but in the theatre of humiliation. The Persians were not crude marauders. Ctesiphon, their capital, glittered with palaces, learning, and the flame of Zoroastrian fire temples. Persian engineers developed advanced siege technologies. Their cavalry, the heavily armoured cataphracts, were among the deadliest forces of the age, able to smash through Roman infantry lines like iron thunder. Shapur was not content to harass Rome's borders. He wanted to reclaim Mesopotamia, Syria, and perhaps even Asia Minor, folding Rome's richest provinces back into what he believed was the natural Persian sphere. Religion too shaped his worldview. As a devout Zoroastrian, Shapur believed himself the earthly champion of Asher cosmic order against the chaos that threatened the world. In this narrative, Rome, with its growing Christian minority, and its emperor, who styled himself a god, could be painted as a force of disorder, a foreign corruption. Victories against Rome were not only political triumphs, they were acts of divine cleansing. Shapur's genius was not just military, but psychological. He knew Rome's pride was both its armor and its weakness. He had watched carefully as Roman propaganda elevated emperors into semi-divine figures. To bring one of these emperors to his knees, not metaphorically but literally, would be to strike at the very soul of Rome. Where Hannibal had won battles and left Rome shaken, Shapur aimed to win symbols and leave Rome broken. Already his campaigns demonstrated this vision. He captured Nisibis and Karrhae cities of strategic and symbolic value, not only defeating Roman legions, but proving Persian armies could match and even surpass them in siegecraft. These victories were celebrated not quietly, but carved into rock reliefs etched into the stone of Persia itself. On cliffs at Naqsh-e Rustam, near the tombs of ancient Achaemenid kings, Shapur had himself depicted trampling enemies' Roman commanders kneeling before him. The message was unmistakable. Persia had risen again, and Rome's days of unquestioned supremacy were numbered. By the time Valerian marched east, Shapur's shadow loomed larger than any foe Rome had faced since Hannibal. This was not a border skirmish. This was the clash of two civilizations, each claiming to be the rightful heir to empire. And only one would emerge unbroken. When Valerian turned his gaze eastward, he knew the stakes were nothing less than Rome's survival. The eastern provinces were Rome's jewels, fertile Syria bustling Antioch, the trade arteries of Mesopotamia that linked the Mediterranean to the riches of Persia and beyond. To lose them would mean more than defeat. It would unravel the empire's economy and prestige. Rome's treasury was already strained, its currency debased, and its armies restless for payment. The East could not be abandoned. So in 256 CE, Valerian assembled one of the finest Roman armies of the 3rd century. Chroniclers described it as a host drawn from every corner of the empire, veteran legions scarred from campaigns on the Rhine cavalry, from the Danube archers, from the east. It was a patchwork of Rome's surviving strength gathered under the purple banners of an emperor who still believed Rome's destiny was unshakable. This was not to be a cautious defense. Valerian's campaign was heralded in official proclamations as the decisive stroke that would silence Persia's ambitions. In an empire weary of defeats, this rhetoric mattered. Rome needed victories, symbols of resilience, to counterbalance the humiliations of the past decades. The presence of the emperor himself at the front was meant to inspire the troops and remind allies that Rome had not forgotten its obligations. At first, success seemed possible. Roman forces relieved besieged cities in northern Mesopotamia, driving back Persian detachments and restoring the sense that imperial order still had teeth. For a brief moment, the emperor's presence appeared to steady the east. Reports carried to Antioch spoke of Rome's banners raised high of Persians, scattered of legions marching with renewed discipline. But beneath this glimmer of hope lurked dangerous realities. Shapur did not meet Valerian head-on. He did not rush into pitched battles where Rome's heavy infantry might grind down his armies. Instead, he retreated, observed, and let the Romans march deeper into hostile ground. His strategy was one Rome should have recognized from Hannibal's shadow, not to shatter Rome with a single blow, but to exhaust her to bleed her dry. For Rome, the logistics of eastern campaigning were brutal. Supply lines stretched thin across arid terrain vulnerable to harassment. Summer heat withered the men, and Persian cavalry struck swiftly, vanishing before the legions could respond. At night, Roman camps trembled with fear of raids, the clang of armor echoing in the dark. The soldiers were not beaten in battle, but gnawed down by attrition, their morale eroding like a cliff face against the sea. And yet, Valerian pressed on. He was emperor. Retreat was unthinkable. Every step eastward, though, carried him closer into Shapur's web. The campaign that had begun as a march of restoration was slowly becoming a march into quicksand. The empire had promised its people a spectacle of triumph. Instead, Rome was delivering itself into the hands of an enemy who understood spectacle far better than they could imagine. Shapur's brilliance lay not in reckless glory, but in patience. Where earlier Persian kings had hurled themselves against Roman walls, he understood that Rome's strength was not invincibility, but endurance. Break that endurance, and even the greatest army would collapse. So he let Valerian march deeper and deeper into Mesopotamia. The Romans expected a decisive clash, a chance to crush Persia and declare victory in one thunderous battle. Instead, they found themselves chasing shadows. Persian forces struck supply trains, ambushed small detachments, then vanished into terrain they knew better than any Roman scout. Valerian's legions, drawn from far-flung provinces, had never fought in such conditions. Exhaustion began to eat at them, morale cracking with each fruitless march. Then came the siege of Nisibis. This city, vital to trade and defense, had already been a battleground in earlier wars. Valerian threw his might against its walls, expecting swift conquest, but the siege dragged on for months. Shapur's troops harried the besiegers relentlessly, never allowing the Romans to settle into order. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared. What should have been a demonstration of Roman discipline became a slow descent into frustration. And within the Roman camp, a far more insidious enemy stirred: disease. The epidemic historians call the Plague of Cyprian had already ravaged Rome's cities, thinning its population and filling its cemeteries. Now it crept through the cramped quarters of Valerian's camp. Soldiers coughed blood, their bodies collapsing with fever and sores. Thousands died where they lay their corpses piled in makeshift graves or left unburied to rot in the heat. The stench alone demoralized those who survived. Some whispered that the gods had abandoned them. Others muttered that perhaps the Christians, still a persecuted minority in the empire, had brought divine punishment. Superstition thrives in the shadow of disease, and the camp was no different. Rumors slithered through the tents like snakes that Shapur had summoned the plague with Persian sorcery, that the emperor himself was ill. Even if untrue, such whispers drained courage more surely than arrows. Valerian tried to hold his army together, but his presence, once a rallying force, began to falter. An emperor should have embodied Rome's eternity, yet he looked worn-aged, strained by the relentless grind. Soldiers began to wonder if the empire itself was fading before their eyes. Meanwhile, Shapur waited. He did not need to storm the Roman camp. Every day Rome weakened itself by hunger, by exhaustion, by sickness. When he finally struck, it would be like toppling a tree already hollow at its core. The great expedition that was meant to restore Roman supremacy had become a march into ruin. What had begun with fanfare was dissolving into despair. And Shapur, the patient hunter, was ready to spring the trap that history would never forget. By the year 260 CE, the once proud army that had marched east under Valerian's banner was a shadow of itself. The plague had gutted its ranks, supplies were all but gone, and desertion spread like wildfire. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor faced not just the loss of a campaign, but the possibility of total annihilation. It was in this moment of desperation that Valerian made a fateful choice. Ancient sources differ on the details, but the outcome was the same. Some Roman accounts say he sought honourable negotiation with Shapur, hoping to secure terms for withdrawal. Persian records insist he came in abject surrender. The truth may lie between an emperor clinging to dignity in a situation where dignity was already slipping away. A meeting was arranged. Neutral ground, both sides, bringing only a small retinue. Such arrangements had precedent in ancient warfare where rulers might meet to discuss peace without fear of treachery. But Valerian forgot that Shapur was not bound by Rome's codes of honour. For the Persian king, this was not negotiation, it was theatre. When Valerian arrived surrounded by a handful of officers and guards, Persian troops closed in. The Romans were outnumbered, trapped, overwhelmed, before they could even draw steel. Some say Valerian raised his sword in one last act of defiance, though whether he did or not hardly mattered. The Emperor of Rome was taken alive. News spread like wildfire. Soldiers who learned their emperor was a prisoner abandoned their posts. The chain of command disintegrated within hours. What might have been an organized withdrawal turned into a panicked rout, men throwing down shields to flee across the barren plains. Entire legions melted away into chaos. For Rome, it was an unthinkable catastrophe. Emperors had been killed before cut down in battle, assassinated in the palace, betrayed by their own guards. But never in all of Rome's long history had an emperor been captured alive by a foreign enemy. The emperor was more than a man. He was the embodiment of Roman supremacy. To see him shackled was to see the empire itself humiliated. Shapur knew it. He had not simply captured a rival king, he had seized the beating heart of Roman pride. Instead of killing Valerian, on the spot he kept him alive. Bound, stripped of regalia, but breathing an emperor, transformed into a trophy. The battlefield was silent now, the dust of trampled standards settling into the earth. In the stillness, Rome's greatest fear had come to pass. Its emperor reduced to prey, its legions scattered, its enemies emboldened. And in the hands of Shapur, the humiliation of Valerian was only beginning. In Shapur's court, Valerian was no longer an emperor. He was a living symbol carefully preserved not for mercy, but for mockery. To kill him outright would have been too merciful. To keep him alive, broken, humiliated, was far more valuable. Persian sources boast, and Roman ones reluctantly confirm, that Valerian was subjected to humiliations designed to turn him from ruler to servant. Most infamous is the image carved into stone reliefs at Naqsh-e Rustam, where Shapur sits tall upon his horse, and a kneeling Roman emperor reaches up not in greeting but in submission. It is said Shapur used Valerian as his mounting block, forcing the Emperor of Rome to kneel so that the Persian king might step on his back when climbing into the saddle. For the Romans, who had long demanded their subjects kneel before them, this inversion was unbearable. It was not simply cruelty, it was theatre. Shapur understood that every envoy, every ambassador, every foreign guest who came to Persia would leave with the same story, Rome's emperor grovelling like a servant. And Shapur ensured this humiliation was immortalized. Sculptures, inscriptions, and ceremonies spread the image of Persian triumph. Valerian, stripped of his purple robes, was dressed in the plain garments of a commoner, fed from clay bowls rather than silver. He lived but only as a breathing reminder that Rome's might had failed. The cruelty was not constant physical torment. Rather, it was a steady erosion of identity. Roman emperors had been worshipped, their images placed in temples, their decrees treated as sacred law. To reduce such a figure to servitude was to dismantle the very idea of Roman supremacy. Some sources claim Valerian was forced to attend Zoroastrian rituals, bowing before Persian fire altars, in gestures that would have horrified his Roman audience. Others suggest he was paraded like a prize animal, before visiting dignitaries an object lesson in the wages of arrogance. Whether all these accounts are literally true matters less than their effect. Rome believed them. The empire's dignity collapsed under the weight of rumour as much as fact. And this was Shapur's genius. He did not merely defeat Rome in battle, he defeated Rome in imagination. Soldiers at the front, senators in the capital, citizens in the markets all whispered of their emperor reduced to servitude. Rome had known defeat before, but never such degradation. For years Valerian lived this way, neither free nor executed. A man awaiting his end, yet forced to endure each day as another nail in the coffin of his empire's pride. His fate was no longer his own. It belonged to Shapur, who could decide whether to make him kneel to display him, or when the moment was ripe to extinguish him. And when that moment came, it would not be swift. Shapur had preserved him this long for a reason. The death of an emperor would have to match the theatre of his captivity. For years Valerian endured the slow-burning humiliation of captivity, the living reminder of Rome's shame. But time works against all men, even emperors. As his health declined, Shapur faced a decision what to do with his prize once it could no longer walk, kneel, or serve as a spectacle. A corpse could inspire martyrs. A quiet death might let Rome reclaim dignity. No, Shapur needed something more, an ending as unforgettable as the captivity itself. And so he chose a fate so infamous it would stain history forever, flaying alive. In Persian tradition, this was not only an execution, it was a ritual act bound in layers of symbolism. To remove a man's skin was to strip him of identity, to reduce him to nothing but flesh. In Zoroastrian belief, it could be framed as purification, the removal of corruption from the world. For Shapur, it was also political theatre. Rome's corruption peeled away before the eyes of Persia and the world. The preparations were meticulous. Ancient sources suggest Valerian was bathed, his body hair shaved, his skin treated with oils to loosen it. He was not to die quickly. He was to be unmade slowly, deliberately. Persian executioners were skilled craftsmen of terror trained to prolong agony without ending life too soon. It began at the extremities, fingers, toes, face. Imagine the emperor of Rome, once seated on a golden throne, now stripped under the knives of his enemies, each incision announcing the unraveling of his majesty. Witnesses said he remained conscious, his screams piercing the halls, his pleas for mercy twisted into propaganda. Persian nobles, foreign envoys, even ambassadors from other lands were summoned to watch. This was no private punishment. It was theatre staged for eternity. The flaying lasted hours, perhaps longer, the executioners working methodically. With every strip of skin, Rome's aura was torn away. Valerian did not die like a soldier in battle, but like an offering sacrificed to Persian supremacy. At last, shock and blood loss ended his suffering. But even in death, he was denied dignity. His body was not granted burial. His remains were treated as material to be reshaped, preserved, and displayed. For Shapur, the emperor's corpse was not the end of the story, but the next act in his campaign of humiliation. News of Valerian's gruesome death would not reach Rome for months. But when it did, it struck like lightning. Soldiers who had once fought proudly under his banner now whispered of his screams. Citizens in the Forum shuddered at tales of his skin. Rome had faced defeat before, but never degradation so methodical, so theatrical, so absolute. Shapur had achieved something Hannibal, Parthian kings, and countless barbarian tribes had failed to do. He had not only broken a Roman army, he had shattered the myth of Roman invincibility by destroying its emperor not as a warrior, but as an example. Death did not end Valerian's humiliation. If anything, it began a darker chapter. Shapur, having reduced Rome's emperor to nothing more than flesh, now ensured that even his corpse would continue serving Persian power. According to multiple accounts, Valerian's skin was carefully preserved, treated, stuffed and reshaped into a ghastly effigy. Craftsmen skilled in Persian leatherwork applied their art not to shields or saddles, but to human remains. The emperor who had once worn purple was now a hollow figure, his skin dressed mockingly in imperial robes displayed like a puppet of conquest. This effigy was not hidden away. Shapur ordered it placed in Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, within a great temple where nobles, ambassadors, and foreign dignitaries could all see it. Imagine stepping into that hall, incense curling toward the vaulted ceilings, fire altars blazing, and among them the grotesque form of Rome's emperor reduced to a relic of humiliation. For Persians, it was a divine sign of Ahura Mazda's blessing upon Shapur's reign. For foreigners, it was an unforgettable warning Persia was supreme, and even Rome's mightiest could be undone. Reports say that Valerian's skin trophy was sometimes carried out for festivals, paraded as a symbol of Persian dominance. Others claim it remained fixed in the temple for years, a constant presence in courtly rituals. Whether on display permanently or ceremonially, its effect was devastating. No Roman envoy could approach the Persian king without seeing in some form the grotesque reminder of what had happened to their emperor. And word spread. Traders carried the tale westward, soldiers whispered it in the camps, and Rome's enemies retold it with glee. In Gaul on the Rhine, in Africa, even in distant Britain, the story spread like poison. The once invincible empire had been humiliated beyond repair. For Romans, humiliation cut deeper than defeat. They had lost battles before, but they always returned rebuilt, avenged. Now, though, their emperor himself had been reduced to an object, a footstool in life, a hide-bound effigy in death. The aura of Rome, the sense that the empire was eternal, had been torn open. Gallienus Valerian's son and co-emperor tried to suppress the story. Official propaganda described Valerian as a martyr for the empire, carefully omitting the grotesque details. But the truth could not be contained. Soldiers who had escaped the disaster told their comrades. Merchants repeated rumors in the marketplaces. The horror seeped into the Roman imagination. The Persians had not just won a war, they had won a symbol, a weapon of the mind. And it was a weapon that would haunt Rome for generations. When news of Valerian's capture and grotesque death finally reached Rome, disbelief turned quickly into despair. At first, senators refused to accept the reports. How could the emperor, Rome's living symbol, have been paraded as a servant, then stripped of his very skin? But the rumors multiplied, too consistent and too widespread to dismiss. Survivors of the Eastern Army whispered the details, and Persian envoys themselves seemed eager to confirm them. Gallienus, now sole emperor, faced an impossible task. He needed to maintain morale, yet every Roman soldier knew what had happened. Official proclamations spoke of Valerian as a fallen hero, omitting the humiliations. But propaganda could not erase memory. Rome's enemies laughed openly. Her allies questioned whether the empire could still protect them. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes tested Roman defences. In the east, provinces slipped further into Persian orbit. The capture of an emperor was not just a military disaster, it was a rupture in the very psychology of empire. For the Romans, the humiliation lingered like a wound that never healed. Their imperial ideology had been built on the idea of Rome as eternal, unconquerable, destined to rule. But Valerian's fate revealed a terrifying truth. Emperors were flesh and blood, vulnerable not only to assassination or defeat, but to degradation that stripped away every ounce of dignity. After Valerian, emperors became more cautious about leading armies in person, sending generals instead to bear the risk. None would gamble the prestige of the purple so recklessly again. For the Persians, meanwhile, Valerian's death became legend. Reliefs carved into stone showed Shapur towering over the kneeling Roman, his horse trampling beneath. Persian poets celebrated the victory, and Zoroastrian priests interpreted it as divine proof that Persia, not Rome, held the favour of heaven. The tale was retold for generations, woven into the fabric of Persian identity. Later cultures found their own meanings in the story. Christian writers portrayed Valerian's torment as divine punishment, Rome reaping the price for persecuting their faith. Medieval European chroniclers used it as a moral fable about the dangers of pride. Renaissance artists painted the emperor's fall as a cautionary allegory of the vanity of power. In each retelling, Valerian's death transcended its own moment, reshaped to suit new audiences and new fears. And in modern times, historians return to it as a case study in the brutal politics of antiquity, where suffering itself could be weaponized, where the body of one man could become a message to nations. Shapur understood something chilling, that humiliation could travel farther than armies echo, longer than battles, and corrode an empire from within. 17 centuries later, the stones of Ctesiphon have crumbled the temple where Valerian's effigy once stood, reduced to dust. But the memory endures. His fate reminds us that no power, however mighty, is immune from collapse, not by armies alone, but by symbols that pierce deeper than swords. Valerian's story is haunting not only for its cruelty, but for its clarity. It shows how fragile empires truly are, how swiftly a ruler can fall from divinity to degradation, how thin the veil of civilization can be when power collides with ambition. Rome believed itself eternal, yet in one man's suffering, the illusion was shattered. The warning still stands. Pride unchecked can become the seed of ruin. And as long as history is remembered, so too will the image of Valerian, once an emperor, then a captive, finally a trophy, echo as one of the darkest lessons ever carved into the human story.